Macedonia was now more powerful than it had ever been, and King Philip II was unmatched by any Argead in living memory. The kingdom, however, had always been unstable, and it was still possible everything could unravel. But Philip was increasing his hold over Macedon, and by extension, the entire Greek world. His son Alexander was growing into a formidable young man, giving the king even more security. Alexander was raised as a typical Macedonian prince, learning how to hunt and fight. Leonidas, his tutor, was a hard taskmaster who believed in tough love. In later life, Alexander joked that his tutor's idea of breakfast was a night march and for supper, a light breakfast. Alexander's most famous childhood story is about the taming of the horse Bucephalus. A Thessalian merchant brought the magnificent stallion to Philip's court, but the horse refused to be controlled and seemed unbreakable. While Philip thought it was not worth buying, Alexander was convinced that they were losing a great horse because they didn't know how to handle him properly. He challenged his father, stating that he could tame the horse. He offered to pay the full price of the horse, 13 talents, if he failed. Alexander noticed that Bucephalus was scared of his own shadow, so he turned him directly into the sun so that shadow was no longer visible. Alexander soothed the horse and slowly mounted it. Little by little, he drew in the bridle and began a trot, and then eventually a full gallop. Philip looked on in stunned silence, shedding tears of joy, and said, "O my son, look thee out a kingdom equal to and worthy of thyself, for Macedonia is too little for thee." Philip was on campaign for most of his adult life, and the mid-340s proved no different. During this time, he was back in Illyria and brought most of it under his control. Thrace suffered the same fate. Philip's activities greatly alarmed the Athenians. They thought of that region as their sphere of influence. In 340, a group of notables from the city of Amphissa took their grievances against Athens to the Amphictyonic Council, accusing them of committing sacrilege by improperly rededicating spoils from the Persian War at Delphi. The Amphissians demanded a symbolic fine of 50 talents, since they were confident in Theban support. The Athenians rejected this demand outright and instead launched a countersuit on Amphissa, accusing them of desecrating sacred land that belonged to Apollo. The council decided to investigate these claims, and they turned out to be true, and this led to yet another sacred war being called, this time against Amphissa. The Thessalians proposed that Philip should be made leader of the Amphictyonic army, which gave Philip a legitimate reason to intervene, so he mustered his army and marched south. Philip's lenient treatment of Phocis in the previous sacred war now bore fruit. He reached Elatia and ordered the city to be repopulated, and during the next few months, the whole Phocian confederation was restored. While the road to Athens lay open, Philip only had part of his army with him and wasn't in a position to attack the city. Instead, he sent ambassadors to Thebes to negotiate for peace. When this news reached Athens, the city went into full panic. When the Athenian assembly was called to emergency session, nobody would step forward to speak. Finally, Demosthenes, the great enemy of Philip, did so. Demosthenes gave the speech of his life, urging the Athenians to fight and calling for an alliance with Thebes. His speech was met with thunderous applause, and they approved of his plan. A group of 10 envoys, including Demosthenes himself, was sent to Thebes. But Philip's envoys were already there, promising the Thebans a share of the spoils to come from their inevitable victory over Athens. Undeterred, Demosthenes stood before the Theban assembly and called for their courage and loyalty. Demosthenes' oratorical abilities may have persuaded the Thebans, along with Athenian promises to foot the bill, and an alliance between Thebes and Athens was formed. Philip now found himself facing a formidable alliance of the two most powerful city-states in Greece. By the summer of 338, Philip had gathered some 30,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry. He was still in no hurry to provoke a massed battle, especially by attacking the good defensive positions chosen by the main Athenian and Theban forces. The two armies were camped a mile or so apart near Chaeronea in early August 338 BC. The Allied army had an estimated 30,000 to 50,000 men. On the Macedonian side, Philip had command of the right flank and placed his son Alexander in command on the left flank, accompanied by a group of Philip's experienced generals. It's thought that on the Allied side, the Athenians were on the left flank, opposite Philip, and the Thebans on the right, opposite Alexander. This is because Diodorus recounts that the young Alexander, eager to prove himself to his father, was the one to lead the charge against the Thebans. He faced the sacred band and destroyed them. In the aftermath of the battle, both Athens and Thebes scrambled to rebuild their city walls in anticipation of a siege. Philip had other plans, though. He was far-sighted and knew that securing a permanent peace was preferable to outright humiliation of the defeated. The king was more concerned about gaining the support of all of Greece for his planned invasion of Persia. He first marched to Thebes, which surrendered to him. The Athenians again were treated very leniently. The Second Athenian League was dissolved, but they were allowed to keep their colony on Samos. Despite his growing power, Philip was not content to simply dominate Greece. He had grander ambitions in mind. In late 338 or early 337 BC, representatives from all Greek states were invited to meet with Philip at Corinth. The resulting treaty and alliance, known as the League of Corinth, established a representative council and a peace treaty among all Greek states. In the first council gathering, Philip proposed a bold idea to unite against Persia and punish them for their destruction of Greek shrines during their invasion in 480 to 479 BC. This proposal was approved, and Philip was elected as the leader with supreme authority to do as he saw fit. In the spring of 337 BC, Parmenio, Philip's most trusted and reliable subordinate, led an advance guard across to Asia Minor, and the war against Persia began. Philip planned to follow a year later with the main army. It was at this time that Philip sowed the seeds of his own downfall. In the aftermath of him becoming hegemon of Greece, Philip decided to take on a seventh wife. Her name was Cleopatra, the daughter of Hippostratus, and niece of a Macedonian general named Attalus. The problem was that Cleopatra was a noble, full-blooded Macedonian, and if she gave birth to a son, it could threaten Alexander's position, since he was only half Macedonian. Tensions were brought to a head at a feast to celebrate the union, where Attalus, Cleopatra's uncle, made a toast that seemed to suggest that Alexander was illegitimate and therefore unworthy of the Macedonian throne. Alexander reacted swiftly, throwing his cup at Attalus and demanding to know whether he was being called a bastard. Philip, who was drunk and incoherent, attempted to intervene but only made matters worse by stumbling and falling flat on his face. Alexander taunted him, saying, "The man who wishes to conquer Asia can't even cross a room." A brutal episode ensued involving Cleopatra's uncle Attalus and a jilted lover named Pausanius, which changed everything before the expedition departed. Pausanius was once Philip's lover, but the king eventually discarded him for a new favorite. Philip's new lover was also confusingly named Pausanias, who we'll call Pausanias II. This Pausanias was eager to prove his manhood and got his chance to do so in battle when he sacrificed himself to save the life of Philip. However, Pausanias II was a close friend of Attalus, and Attalus blamed Pausanias I for his friend's death and sought revenge for the death of his friend. During the winter of 337 to 336 BC, Attalus threw a party in which he invited Pausanias I and got him severely drunk. Then Pausanias was severely beaten and possibly, how can we say this politely, taken advantage of by a number of different men. Pausanias took his grievance to Philip, but the king was hesitant to punish his pregnant wife's uncle, a man he had just named co-commander of the advance guard. Hoping to placate Pausanias, Philip promoted him to be one of the 7 royal bodyguards. To secure his western flank, Philip married off his daughter Cleopatra to Alexander of Epirus. He would use the wedding and accompanying festival to celebrate his success and popularity, and guests from all over Greece were welcomed to Macedonia. The opening procession was a grand spectacle, with statues of the 12 Olympian gods parading through the streets of Agai, the Macedonian capital. These were followed by a statue of Philip himself, who had won the favor and approval of the gods. Philip had carefully orchestrated his entrance into the theater, waiting until the perfect moment to appear with his son Alexander and Alexander of Epirus by his side. The cheers of the crowd echoed around the theater as Philip basked in the adulation, a moment that seemed to encapsulate all that he had achieved. While Philip was basking in his moment of greatest triumph, standing alone center stage, Pausanius, the disgruntled ex-lover, broke away from the rest of the bodyguards and dashed toward the king. He produced a dagger, which he thrust into Philip's side. The king fell to the ground and was dead within seconds. The assassin, pursued by his fellow bodyguards, made a desperate attempt to escape on horseback, but he tripped and fell and was caught and killed. The motive for Pausanius' actions remains a matter of debate, but in all likelihood he acted out of personal revenge. Within hours of the previous king's death, Antipater acted decisively and proclaimed Alexander as the new king of Macedonia. The scale of Philip's success was unprecedented. His son would carve out a vastly greater empire, and his deeds are described far more fully, while so much of what Philip did must remain a mystery. There was surely far more to Philip's reign than we can now reconstruct, but what we cannot doubt is that without Philip, the story of Alexander would be very different. And that's it for the incredible reign of King Philip II of Macedon. In the next episode, we will discuss the early years of the reign of Alexander the Great. Stay tuned.